All right. No better way to clear a room of developers than a test talk. Uh, it was elbow to elbow just a minute ago. Anyway, I'm glad to be here, and I'm here to talk about test automation. So, as she mentioned earlier, my name is Dan Cuellar. I'm the creator of Appium. I'm a principal development manager at Foodit, so I'm in charge of all the developers and all the QA engineers at Foodit. Previously, I worked at Shazam and a dating site called Zeus and Microsoft, and a long time ago, I went to school. So I'm here today to talk about Appium, and I have, I think, 19 more minutes to do that, which is the shortest talk I think I've ever given. So I'm going to have a lot of fun very quickly. So let's talk about the evolution of Appium to start. So Appium didn't just exist, it came into being, as most things do, out of necessity. So I started a new job at Zeus, which was a dating site, and it all started with the most terrifying 5 words I've ever heard as someone who has to manage software testing. Does anyone have a guess as to what these are? Yell something out. If not, it's these. They're a bit less terrifying nowadays, but at the time, the problem with the App Store was that when you made a mistake, it would take you several, let's just say weeks, for you to get that fix out to all your consumers. You would have to submit a bill to Apple, pass their static analysis, pass an in-person review, release it to the App Store, and wait for all of your customers to choose to update to it. So if you had a revenue-losing bug in your product, you were talking about that bug existing for, in the likelihood, several weeks on most of your customers' devices, which is really, really bad. And coming from a web background, I'd gotten used to the days of, move fast and break shit, as they used to say, because the code's on the server. If there's ever a problem with the code, you just put better code on the server, and then the problem goes away. With mobile apps, it's not like this. Unfortunately, nowadays, Apple's gotten a bit better, and your reviews don't take, a week or 2 weeks or whatever they used to take. But that's where the problem started. And I thought, well, how do I solve this? The obvious answer was better test automation. And so I thought back to my days working on, how many of you know what this is? I've seen one of these before, these round disks. This is disappointing, no one's raising their hands. I feel old. But used to, we ship software on these things. I used to work on Microsoft Office, and we used to print a 4 DVD set of Microsoft Office to send to people. And if we ever made a mistake, it was quite expensive to then destroy all of those DVDs and print new ones. And the App Store kind of brought me back to this point. And that's when Appium came about. So I looked into everything that was out there, and I thought it was all quite terrible, so I decided to make my own thing. And here's what Appium is, for those of you who don't know. It's an implementation of the Selenium JSON wire protocol that controls native and hybrid iOS applications, and now Windows and Mac applications. So the idea was, I used to automate websites with Selenium. It was a tool, it worked pretty well. Why can't I use a similar tool to automate my iOS and Android applications to get the company from not release revenue-losing bugs anymore? And I guess, lastly, it is now the most popular open-source cross-platform automation framework available. So, diving a bit deeper, here's kind of what we stand for. Number one, we are sort of a broker. We want to use the best standardized APIs and techniques. We don't want to do hacks. We don't want to use private APIs. We don't want to root your phone. We don't want to do anything like that. We want to use the best vendor-supplied APIs out there. But we're going to provide an intermediate layer to bridge that for you and make it simple. We want you to be able to code in the language you want to code in. When UI automation JavaScript came out for Xcode or for iOS, it was a JavaScript test automation language that Objective-C developers were supposed to use, which is ridiculous. We thought, if you have a team that already writes tests, they should be able to write in the language they're comfortable with. And if not, you should at least be able to write in the language you're developing the application in, because it's silly to have one language for testing and one language for development. So we support pretty much any language you can think of. Thirdly, we don't want you to modify the application you're testing. So anyone who's worked in QA long enough knows the debug build is not always a representative sample of what your users will experience. And so we wanted to sort of not require you to do anything silly to your app to use our automation. And lastly, we want it to stay free and open source, and there's no way it's not going to be, as we've donated it to the JavaScript Foundation now. So it will be free and open source for life. Cool. But I'm here to talk about what's next. So many of you probably know what Appium is if you're a mobile developer, and you might have used it. And going back to the problem we had earlier, The problem was I had something I needed to automate, and I wanted to automate it like I automated websites. And we've solved that problem for iOS and Android. But in solving that problem, we realized something much bigger. And that's simply that you could probably have one protocol to automate everything, be it a starship, a TV, an Xbox, whatever it is, you can automate it with one protocol. Automation is generic enough that basically you find UI elements, you interact with them, and then you check their state. And if you develop a protocol like the WebDriver protocol, you can apply it to anything. As we showed with Appium, Appium only required very minimal edits to be made to the WebDriver spec to support mobile. And once we sort of worked those kinks out, we've realized, well, for TV and for watches and for other things, very minimal work is needed to the protocol to support all these things. And then lastly, what we actually want to happen is like what's happened with Selenium, where now the browser vendors supply the Selenium implementation. It's no longer a bunch of open source geeks like myself reverse engineering Internet Explorer. Microsoft provides Edge driver, and Apple supplies Safari driver, and Google supplies Chrome driver. And we've made some progress here, and I'll talk about it a bit later. So this is sort of the idea, and this is kind of how it's come to be. It all started with Selenium in 2004. A man named Jason Huggins produced this tool called Selenium for automating websites. Later, a guy named Simon Stewart iterated upon it with something called WebDriver, which has the protocol which Appium leverages, which I created back in 2011. And then now in 2014, we have Microsoft jumping on board and producing something called WinAppDriver, which allows you to automate Windows 10 applications. And we have something I wrote along with Stuart Russell called Appium for Mac, which allows you to automate Mac applications with the Selenium protocol. So the way I look at it is like this. When Beethoven writes a symphony, or what's an Austrian composer? Strauss. When Strauss writes a symphony, he doesn't use a different language for every instrument in the orchestra. He doesn't even know how to play an oboe or a bassoon, I swear. But he knows musical notation, and that's how he tells the people who operate the instruments what to do. Appium serves this exact same purpose for test automation. Modern web applications have end-to-end scenarios across multiple devices. If you take a product like the one I work at, which is an online delivery service called Foodit, a customer can place an order from an iPhone, an Android device, mobile website, or the actual website. Then an iPad or an Android device in the kitchen will get that order, and some chef will confirm it. Then there's a driver out there with a phone, and he's taking it to the customer. So if you look at that scenario, we've got 3 different devices. So if we want to reliably end-to-end automate that scenario, it's going to be very difficult if we have to use the native language for each of those platforms. And that's where Appium comes in. Appium is that musical notation that allows you to orchestrate your end-to-end testing. And for a very literal example of that, I have a video here of Jonathan Lips doing just that. I don't know if the sound's going to work, but I'll put my face up to the laptop if it doesn't. Can anyone hear that? So what he's doing here is he has a backing band, which he's programmed Appium to play the drums and the piano apps on Android and iOS to back his guitar work. And so this is an example of cross-platform automation with one framework as orchestration. So I put my face near here. I'll stop it there, but you get the idea. What you're seeing there is an Appium script connecting to 5 different devices. It's sending, the hits on the hi-hat to those 2 Android apps that have the drum kit open. It's sending the keyboard notes to those keyboard apps you have, all with the WebDriver protocol, all at once. So we're orchestrating a quite complicated end-to-end test. In this case, it's music. But in your case, it can be whatever the scenario you need it to be is. And so it all works very simply. We use HTTP to sort of unify everything. Everything works with HTTP. So when you write a test script in the language of your choice, all that language is doing is making HTTP requests and sending them to Appium, which is our server written in Node.js. We then will translate those requests into calls to the appropriate underlying APIs to talk to the device you need to communicate with. So you can see here, you don't need to know basically what you're talking to. You just send us HTTP JSON, and we do the rest. This works really nicely for backwards compatibility. When Apple released XCUI tests, their new automation framework for iOS, people who had Appium scripts didn't have to rewrite them because XCUI test is a Swift Objective-C based framework, and UI automation, the prior one for the previous 6 years, was a JavaScript framework. If you had invested heavily in UI automation tests, you had to rewrite everything when this came out. If you had written Appium tests, there was pretty minimal work required, much more minimal than rewriting everything, to then support these. And that's a really nice quality of Appium, is that because we're the middleman, if you want to talk to an ancient Android device that doesn't have the latest automation protocol from Google, we'll just use a different one because we have 3 different implementations for Android. One that uses UI Automator 2, one that uses UI Automator 1, and one that uses the instrumentation framework. The instrumentation framework appears on very ancient Android devices, so it's quite handy to have. But anyways, that's the gist of how it all comes together. So sort of the project by the numbers. We have over 5,000 stars on GitHub, 2,500 forks. Over 200 people have contributed a line of code to Appium, and we have over 5,000 commits. We had over 150,000 downloads of our V1, but that was many years ago. We fixed over 5,000 bugs, which is kind of embarrassing, but also kind of cool. And lastly, we have over 40,000 downloads a month on NPM. So what this all says is, don't worry, people use this. And if you have problems, they will get found and they will get fixed. Even though we're not a pay-for company, we're doing this out of volunteer. There is a big community and we will support it. So getting back to my whole star driver thing, I wanted to bring it back to desktop. And in particular, Microsoft, which is a company near and dear to my heart, as I used to work there. And so when I worked there, I could never imagine showing you the video I'm about to show you right now. What you're about to see is a Microsoft product manager. And what he's going to do is he's going to use Bash on Windows to trigger an automation script, which I believe is written in Python, an open source language, to automate Windows Phone with an open source technology, Appium, which is a long way to have come from the days when I worked there.
I'd like to give you another example of how you can use various languages to write your tests. You really can use whatever language you prefer. Here we have Bash on Windows up, and we're going to use the Linux Python to run a test written in Python to test the Inbox Calculator app in Windows. We can look at the test. You can see it's in Python. It has the app ID for the Inbox Calculator, and it's pointing at our Appium server. So Appium really is an incredibly flexible framework, and this is a great example of that.
All right.
Here's
So,
another example.
all right, let's stop there. So what you just saw was the same framework we used to automate mobile apps, automating a Windows 10 app, the calculator in particular. And this was all thanks to the people at Microsoft. When they heard about Appium, they wanted to get on board, and they asked us, what could they do to get on board with it? And what we came up with was WinAppDriver, or what together we came up with. So they now publish their own driver for Appium. It implements the same protocol that we use for everything. And so if you want to bring a Windows 10 app into your automated test, you just use the WinAppDriver, which is bundled with Appium. You'll just provide the platform name as Windows. But not to be outdone, not all vendors are quite so friendly, and some require us to write our own. And so this is a project I've worked on. I wrote the Mac driver for Appium, along with a guy from Intuit named Stuart Russell. And it works the same way. So basically using the same code, minus a few subtle differences, I can automate the Mac calculator app. Fortunately, actually this isn't the calculator app I'm going to show you. This is sort of a tour de force of what you can do with Appium for Mac. You're going to see dragging and dropping of text and all sorts of fun and interesting things. But it's fully featured, and it's about to roll out of beta soon, hopefully. But this is a test where we type some text, we drag it around, relocate it using drag and drop. We're using the full operating system. You'll see we use the save menu later. And the quit menu as well. So you have access to all of this because we've written a Mac driver that responds to the WebDriver protocol. So kind of what I'm getting at here is that the Appium started as a mobile automation framework, but then we realized we haven't really solved the problem we set out to solve. I thought we had, but we had only solved it for mobile apps. The real problem is I need a language to automate absolutely everything in, because I probably work somewhere where we have more than one type of device in our end-to-end scenarios. And that's what Appium and StarDriver seek to accomplish. So I have a few minutes for questions, and then there's someone coming on after me. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah, okay, just maybe we will have an applause as we had for every speaker. Thank you. And yeah, are there questions, guys? Hands? Questions? No? Was it so awesome that there are no questions to be asked? All right, who? Somebody? Yeah.
I have a question. Will have the actual like Chrome driver, Firefox driver, and so on work in Appium, or it's a different interface? The driver for the browsers and the driver for the application and so on.
It's a very good question. So if you want to run Chrome on an Android device, Appium currently does that for you. We actually take all the commands you send and ferry them across to Chrome driver, which runs inside of Android. For now, Selenium is its own separate thing. It makes sense to bring it in at some point, I think, or at least support bringing it in. But we do support it for on mobile phones. And it is the same protocol, so you can use the Appium bindings to talk to Selenium and vice versa. But it is not bundled with it for desktop browsers. You have to download a separate file.
Thank you.
Was it here? Wasn't here? Yeah. Okay.
Is there some kind of UI automation? Drag and drop and clicking to create a tag, a test?
A WYSIWYG automation editor. Is that what you see is what you get, kind of?
Yeah.
We're working on building something like that. We used to have one for older versions of Appium that I wrote. We've since retired the old app, and we have a new Atom-based app called Appium Desktop, which supports Windows and Android and Mac at the moment. iOS, working on getting the Mac in there. And it doesn't do like click to record, but you can sort of, it has buttons where you can select an element and then click the button for the command you want to execute on that element. So it's a bit of that. But it's not done yet. If you want to use the older GUI, we do have that in there. It just hasn't been ported forward. But I know it's pretty high atop the list of things.
So work in progress. Thanks.
Any more questions? Hands up there. Yeah.
Hello, I'm a software tester of mobile applications, and for example, for Android, I have developed my automated tests with Appium in Java, and for iOS, I'm using Swift mainly because the developer believes that the tool is much more powerful. I would like to know if the Appium for iOS is as powerful or even more powerful than doing the tests on using Xtest.
XCUI test. So the iOS implementation uses XCUI test under the hood, so they are one and the same. So there may be some functionality that isn't exposed with XCUI test, but in theory, Appium just wraps XCUI tests, so anything it can do, Appium can do. But if it's not exposed, you can file a feature request and we'll add it. But in theory, yeah, they're the same framework, so there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to incorporate a capability there.
And in terms of language, is it advisable to program in any kind of language, or it's advisable to?
I've always found using the language that your app is written in is the best, because I find that developers write the best tests because they wrote the code. And having that barrier of having a different language, while it can be accommodating for an SDET or a QA team that automates, it prevents the developers from getting involved. So I always recommend using the same language.
Thank you.
I think I'm done. I had a little bit to go at the end, but I'll skip it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.